Alrighty, y'all, we also got the patch notes, and I say patch notes here as plural, not just patch note. You get, okay, there was 2 patches. Stick with me here. They released notes for 2 patches that are coming to the game for the Season 6 release. This is going to touch on a ton of balancing changes, Paragon changes, skill changes, different affixes, different items, all of that. But you're here for the Necromancer. Why? Because at least for right now, it's the only thing that I cover because we can't really cover the Spiritborn though. But look forward to Spiritborn on this channel as well. I'm not just gonna be a one-trick pony. I'm gonna play more than one class this season. I'm terrified, please help me. But basically what we got was a huge patch notes that came from the PTR that went into a build that we have now downloaded. You can early download it on your Battle.net client, and this will be there for when the game releases. We can actually play the expansion. We then also got patch notes based off of tweakings from the patch, which we've already downloaded, which will then tell us the changes that came after that patch. This will be going out, I think, first day, maybe, like day 1 patch when the expansion drops. It's not super important, but what we need to understand is the total implication of all the things that happened. And a lot of things happened. Like if I search for Necromancer, a lot of things happened that changes how the Necromancer works. And while I could go through every single list item and we could scroll and scroll and scroll, I don't like doing it that way. I made a data sheet, and the data sheet's really easy to follow. So let's just go ahead and talk about the clear winners, the clear losers. The kind of in the middle doesn't really matter, but I had to call it out because like technically it's a buffer, technically it's a nerf. And then just a couple of things I think are worth kind of looking out for moving forward. I'm just going to go ahead and like cut to the quick just for people who like hate listen to me talk, which it's a non-zero amount of people. Hopefully they're still subscribed to the channel because that helps me out a whole bunch. Go ahead and click that button, by the way, if you haven't already. It means the world to me. But there are clear winners here. There are builds that are going to be like bananas level strong based off what we've seen just from these patch notes, and not even taking into account like the vast amount of like power differential that happened in the Paragon, etc. These are going to be your minion builds, very specifically, which will now include Shade Mist as like a full-on build, just straight up mages, straight up golem build, potentially even Thorns Golem. Shout outs to Bacterial out there. I know you're excited about that. Bloodlance, of all things, got like a pretty insane buff to its overall damage output. Very excited about that. Sever as well, just from a quality of life standpoint, because I already thought that Sever was going to be one of the best builds walking into this season. And then in addition to that, and really speculative general blood builds, this one's going to be a little bit harder to prove, but I promise you I'm going to do my best here. So there's a really impossible to determine what they mean by this note in the patch notes. Fixed an issue where the following Necromancer skills had incorrect values. Reap, Hemorrhage, Bone Splinters, I assume all of that deals with how much essence they're generating. Blighted Corpse Tendrils, sure, why not? And then Rathma's Vigor. Now, what was changed about Rathma's Vigor in the first place? Rathma's Vigor in the PTR said that after you were healthy for 15 seconds, your blood skill would overpower, and you could reduce this by 2 seconds via blood orbs. Now, why is that a problem? Because in the current game, Rathma's Vigor only requires 12 seconds before you overpower, meaning that you only have to chop off 12 seconds via blood orbs to be able to overpower. So going from 12 to 15 is a substantial nerf in the output of builds that are looking to overpower, even ones that can generate a ton of blood orbs. And when I first noticed this in the PTR, I assumed that it was wrong. There were a bunch of things that were just changed even though they weren't really called out, and they were either reverted to old numbers or they were just randomly nerfed but it wasn't specifically referred to. And I always assumed that this was just wrong. My gut feeling says that Rathma's Vigor was incorrectly nerfed, that we weren't actually supposed to see 15 seconds there. Complete speculation. If it's not the case, you can kind of just ignore this whole line item here, but that's what I think it is. The next big thing to call out is a change to the Unmaker Helmet. And we're going to go ahead and look at it because it's another thing that's like kind of hard to wrap your head around until you really look at the examples and how the build is currently working. The Unmaker Unique Helmet had one of its affixes changed to Chance for Soul Rift to deal double damage. A really cool and powerful affix. But if you look at the affixes now on the helmet, you might notice that we're missing out on a pretty powerful one. Unmaker originally said, damage reduction, imperfectly balanced ranks, resource generation, and ranks to Soul Rift itself. Instead of ranks to Soul Rift, you now have chance for Soul Rift to deal double damage. Ranks to Soul Rift, which you could obviously, greater masterwork and crit and get affixes on, would grant you 8 skill ranks to Soul Rift, drastically increasing its base skill damage, making the procs from Unmaker significantly stronger as well, but on top of that, drastically reducing the cooldown of this skill. Giving it a chance for Soul Rift to deal double damage kinda seems cool, right? Like Deathless Visage has Bone Spear cast twice, Grease of the Empty Tomb has Sever cast twice, etc. The issue here being that if I were to go and temper on Soul Rift to my weapon, boop, at 3 Masterwork crits, I would already have chance for Soul Rift to deal double damage. Getting greater than 100% doesn't really do anything. So they've taken the base scaling damage of Soul Rift and drastically reduced it. Now, is this strictly bad? I think, realistically speaking, the majority of people experiencing playing with this item, it's just strictly worse for. But it does open up something very slightly interesting that only deals with abusing Unmaker's ability to snapshot overpowering and how we were going to play the build in the season, which is basically force it to overpower and then trigger it 1,000,000 times per second using Bone Spirit, which is what we're still going to do. But if the helmet actually gets a high enough chance for Soul Rift to deal double damage, that means we don't need a two-handed weapon to be able to get to 100%. We could use a main hand and an offhand. So like most other things in the game that have chance to cast double on it, or chance to deal double damage on it, you can typically get there by triple masterworking onto a single weapon, and then the item itself. What that opens up is the ability to use Doombringer. The reason why Doombringer is so important here is because, again, Unmaker is ultimately an overpower build, and it turns out basically doubling your maximum life on Doombringer adds a ton of overpower damage to your kit as well. The next big change is going to come to Kalan's Edict. They just buffed the crap out of this thing. Kalan's Edict used to just grant you attack speed, which oddly enough, you didn't really need to be able to hit your total attack speed cap for the Cult Leader legendary node, and most people didn't really worry about it. And most minion builds were actually going to be using Affliction because it was just strictly more damage. But now Kalan's Edict says that not only will it grant you 3% attack speed for every minion that you have, but it'll also grant you 3% increased damage for each active minion that you have. The attack speed alone wasn't good enough, but making it easier to be able to hit crit cap and stuff because you don't need attack speed on your gear, and then also granting a huge damage multiplier, like with 11 minions, so it's a 33% damage multiplier from the key passive. It's still not interesting, but at least now it's powerful enough where you'll end up using it. So bare minimum, minion stocks went way up, and this isn't the only thing buffing them. A very slight note here, they drastically increased the amount of Fortify that you gain from Necrotic Carapace. I think at 3 points, it now grants 15% Fortify whenever you generate a corpse. That's insane bananas. Most builds could get away with running 1 point of Necrotic Carapace before, and that was back when it was at 2% Fortify, and now even just that 1 point will grant you 5% Fortify. Basically, every single Necromancer build needs to be running Necrotic Carapace bare minimum, and now you're going to be drastically rewarded for doing so with very little skill investment. They did buff Thorns Golem, and I guess Thorns Necro by extension, so let's go ahead and look up Bone Golem here. Bone Golem's active skill now says that your armor conversion for Thorns goes from 70% to 200%, so that's like nearly triple the amount of Thorns that you got from armor, which definitely needed to happen because Thorns based off of armor didn't really make sense when you were only getting like 1,000 armor. That's max cap for armor, and you don't need to get anything above that. So we're drastically down from the thousands upon thousands upon thousands we used to get on the build. So nearly tripling how much you get from this basically just kind of equalizes that. Is it enough? Probably not, but it's there and it's kind of cool. But now let's talk about all the different things that now scale off of your minions, something that the community has been asking for a very long time. Now, when we realized that things didn't scale off your minions, like what do I mean here? The Ring of Mendeln, the Shade Mist aspect that says that your minions do shadow damage over time, when in reality it was the Necromancer, and most notably the new aspect, Fell Gluttony, which said that your Golem now did an explosion whenever you activate it, also scaled off you. Well, now it scales off your minions, and it turns out your minions have pretty big damage scalers. Ring of Mendeln is one of the most iconic unique items that the Necromancer has had for a very long time, and they've desperately wanted it to be good for minions. It used to be based off lucky hit chance, they added minion masteries to the ring itself, but sadly, it turns out that a damage explosion effect that scaled off of the Necromancer and not your minions wasn't good enough on a minion-focused build with a minion-focused ring. Now that it will scale off of your minions, have you looked at how many damage scalers your minions get because they're more niche? The answer is a ton. Fel Gluttony was always pretty insane considering that it had a huge base damage effect. Now, this scaling off of your golem's damage multiplier that you can get with skill ranks on your chest as well is obviously going to be a huge damage bonus. And the cool part is that it happens separate from your activation. So the activation goes off and then this damage explosion goes off as well. The fact that it never scaled off of your golem was always very weird. We obviously didn't get to play around with it for too long. But making this change makes it so that the golem-focused minion build, something that kind of fallen by the wayside because mages were just so much better at actually scaling, just gained a huge tool. Putting this onto a two-handed weapon is like an insanely, like, look at it, like this explosion, which I'll be able to trigger all the time with enough cooldown reduction, is basically the same explosion as Ring of Mendeln. It doesn't require me to hit 6 times. I don't need to have my other minions out, etc., etc. You probably will have them, but you get what I'm saying here. The golem build actually gained a huge tool. Every single minion build gained a huge tool from Ring of Mendeln, and even the Shade Mist build, which was something that is also empowered by a different change, is just like, it has the potential to scale incredibly high because the base damage on it was already high, and then the multipliers for your minions will only take it further. The reason why I very specifically bring up Shade Mist is because Aspect of the Damned, something that says that it increases your shadow damage but never worked for your minions, well, that works for your minions as well. Damned saying that the moment that you curse a target, your minions would now deal more than 2 times their total shadow damage. Most notably, Shadow Mages is who we would look to scale with this, or Shade Mist, the thing that does the shadow damage that scales off. You get what I'm saying here. Huge multiplier. Mages never got access to it, but it was one of the things you would run on your build absolutely if you could, and now you just can. They also buffed Cult Leader. So Cult Leader right now says that once you get your minions up to 100% attack speed, doesn't matter what cap it's in, just altogether 100% attack speed, they're going to deal 30% damage for every 20%. So that meant that it was a 150% damage multiplier, so a 2.5 multi. Cult Leader now says that you gain 40% per 20 as opposed to 30% per 20. So what that means is a 200% damage bonus, so a 3 times multi. Now, will that be enough to make them the absolute S tier builds? That's kind of hard to say. They added a ton of additional tools to the other builds, and we've already experienced them. Like Bone Spirit is just absolutely cracked out of its gourd. Spirit Wave is now like so insanely powerful because it turns out that scaling off of base life, which is now down to 400, and then still reaching like 20,000 maximum life, adds on a lot of additional damage to Bone Spirit. And then things like Unmaker with Soul Rift being able to dip into Overpower. There are a lot of Blood Wave being able to be Shadow Blood Wave again, and then also Overpower and basically be spammed once every second. It's really hard to beat these builds, but Minions, if you weren't aware, had basically fallen into pure obscurity last season. They were like, at best, C tier builds, even in comparison to the Necromancer itself. It was nowhere close. But they gained a massive amount of multipliers, and if they don't end up in like the top of A tier across the board, I would be incredibly surprised. Another big change here is the Mutilator Plate for Bloodlance. They basically made it so that Mutilator's worst stat, which was Bloodlance Duration, a stat that I've derided since its inception in the game, swapped over to Bloodlance now deals double damage. In combination with this, they also changed it so that the chance for Bloodlance to hit twice is now also chance for Bloodlance to deal double damage, so you can actually reach 100% chance for Bloodlance to deal double damage. So if you haven't looked at Mutilator Plate in a while, damage reduction from targets affected by a blood skill is absolutely insane. Maximum life is a second absolutely insane stat. Ranks to Bloodlance, and now Bloodlance can deal double damage on here, means that you don't need it on your weapons at all. And what did we already talk about that opening up for the Unmaker? Well, that means that you can easily run Doombringer on a build that cares about overpowering without losing out on the weapon temper that was so important for scaling your damage. Putting Bloodlance deals double damage onto an offhand and then it on your Mutilator Plate as well means you can still reach 100% and enjoy your nearly double total maximum life from Doombringer. That's insane. A very small thing, and it kind of doesn't really matter, but I actually just want to speak to this experience because, again, like the community every once in a while likes to make fun of the Diablo 4 developers for checks notes here, listening to and incorporating feedback about the game that we're all passionate about. But a very small little thing came up over the past couple of seasons once they've added tempers to the game. And it was something that really struck me as odd and that I called out to the developers in particular. We had a stat that said resource generation while wielding a scythe. While there were generic resource generation stats here, so like 27% resource generation, while wielding a scythe specifically stronger, so much more stronger that they would actually like directly impact the outcome of certain builds' functionality if they worked. Sadly, resource generation while wielding a scythe didn't actually work in game, but not only did it not work in game, it was hilariously restrictive. Scythes were swapped over to the minion weapon. They were no longer just a thing that said like life on kill. They gave us a bunch of two-handed weapons to have available to us. We already had two-handed swords for critical strike damage. We gained two-handed maces for overpower and two-handed axes for damage over time. What that meant was that we had multiple options for a slow weapon base, so you didn't even really get that benefit from wielding a scythe. You would only use this on a minion build. Minion builds, which classically don't have any essence issues, don't need to generate essence, and would never use this type of resource generation on that build. Not only was it a broken stat, it was a dead stat. And what that meant was that something that theoretically should be empowering necromancers, something that should be a tool specific to our class that would give us a leg up, something to compete with, this incredibly powerful resource generation stat, would never be used on any build, even if it did work. But by changing this stat over to whenever you're using a two-handed weapon, means that you could use it with your maces, use it with your axes, use it with your swords, use it with your scythes if you still wanted to. So Bone Spear that wants to use a two-handed sword and wants to be at 100% resource all the time, gets to use this very powerful stat. Overpowering builds like Bloodlance and Blood Surge that typically spend a huge amount of resource and will often have resource generation issues, also now get to use this stat. And hey, if you're playing a damage over time build, I'm sorry for you. I'm sorry for your loss. I hope that you're able to recover. But if you are enjoying it, not to completely poo-poo you for enjoying that, sadly it just doesn't really scale well right now. But now, while using a two-handed axe, especially on Blight that always had huge resource issues, something that we had to solve very specifically by adding Starless Skies to it, while still being able to hit our attack speed caps, this is a bunch of nuance that you don't need to worry about. But now you can also benefit from it. My hope is that it's also fixed and will work. But the reason why I wanted to call this out is because this is an incredibly niche, incredibly small, nobody cared about this thing. But it was broken, and it was trash, and it wasn't really serving us any good purpose. And I sent this feedback in. And the very next patch notes, we got it right here. They're like, hey, you know what? That's right. Like, that doesn't really make sense. At first it did, but once we added these other things, this needed to be tuned up too. I just wanted to call it out because it's just very cool that even these things that like maybe nobody cares about, the people who do call it out. Devs look at it and they go, hey, you're right, we should change that. And then they put in the time and money. Like this cost, you know, Blizzard and ostensibly Microsoft money to make this happen. I think that's cool. And then it's almost like I kind of foreshadowed this. They actually did cap Whither. Now, it's going to be hard to say whether or not this is true, but as of more than a season ago, they intended to cap the Whither legendary node. They doubled the bonuses that you get, but then capped it at 1200 intelligence. So getting up to 3000 intelligence wasn't like quintuply multiplying our damage or whatever the math looks like. Supposedly, they actually have fixed the cap. Now in the PTR, it wasn't actually capped. It said it had a cap, but it didn't actually function that way. But these are the notes after the PTR. So I assume they finally got it. What this means though is that damage over time builds are finally going to be doing the damage that they should have been doing more than a season ago, and we'll finally see what the fall of that looks like. My assumption is not particularly great, and that's why overpower builds and crit builds are dominating the Necromancer meta right now. What that means though, is we're gonna have a really good leg to stand on when we inevitably complain about it and hopefully get those exact same devs who cared about that two-handed weapon nonsense I was just talking about and address damage over time as well, because it's a big pain point and it kind of stinks that it's just been falling by the wayside. But Minions just got a really nice cleanup. Maybe dot builds can too. Very minor stuff like Grease of the Empty Tomb don't have Reaper's Pursuit on them anymore, but instead just straight up have movement speed, meaning that you're not running at base movement speed while walking through a town or moving through an area where you haven't actively dealt damage to something within the past 5 seconds. That's a huge quality of life change. I'm glad that they were willing to just kind of say like, yeah, you know what, cool idea, didn't really make it all the way there. Let's go ahead and fix that for you. So those are the big things to note. There's like very, very minor things elsewhere, but they're more generic, like certain rune words are different. Is that going to impact different builds differently? Of course it's going to, but they're all just like generally better, and the really powerful ones generally either like don't exist anymore or are just significantly weaker. So I'll have to play around with that before I can tell you like, hey, this one buffed this build very specifically. You know, I don't have omniscience. I can't pretend to tell you something that I haven't personally tested myself. So that's what I got for you. right, we got some cool stuff. We got some cool buffs. Really excited to see how it kind of all works together, how it all ends up playing together. I do want us to experience a stat squish because there was supposed to be one and we ended up doing more damage than we had ever dealt before. So I'd like to see those numbers come down. But walking into the expansion, basically there are more completely viable Necromancer builds than have ever existed at any other time in the game. We are adding so many build guides to max roll as well. It's kind of scary to me, if I'm going to be honest with you, because it just means a lot more overhead and a lot more stuff that like we need to test to make sure it works, etc., etc. But we have more guide writers on the class. We are going to bring you just like the best stuff that we possibly can. And the changes in these patch notes here shine a really, really good light on the future of the class as a whole. There's still a lot of work to be done. I hate when people say that, right? There's still a lot of things that I believe could be done to make the class as a whole better, more consistent, more cogent, more intuitive, etc. But for the builds that we have, which is now a long list of viable endgame builds, I think more than any other class in the game by a far margin. And they're all more than good enough. They're all completely viable. They're all completely competent. They all do good damage. There'll be variously levels of strong, but they're all great. So look forward to playing Necromancer coming up this season. Look forward to my Spareborn coverage as well, because I am going to be playing another class. I know, scary. Promise you I'm not abandoning the Necromancers. You couldn't literally pull these dead corpses out of my cold dead hands if you even tried. But I'm really excited for it. Show it down in the comments. Let me know what you're excited about, what you thought about. If I missed anything in the patch notes that you think that was relevant, just scream at me. Scream at me down in the comments. I try to answer all of them, and I think I spend too much time doing that, if I'm going to be honest with you. My mental health needs a break at some point. But until I decide that it's not going to work anymore, let me know what you think. If you're brand new here, subscribe to the channel. It would mean a ton. Leave a like on the video as well if you liked it. If you didn't, do it anyways. Screw the system, man. Tell that algorithm to kick a can. Kick rocks, algorithm. I don't even like this, but I'm going to click it anyways. It would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.